topical. We have 4 presentations this afternoon, and then afterwards we'll have a little bit of a round table and talk about what we saw and what we didn't see in these presentations this year. So I think we'll be able to get done probably by 6 o'clock. We're a half an hour ahead, which is good.
Doesn't always happen.
It does not always happen. Particularly not on 9 o'clock. In any event, we might be joined. Melissa Allen had to leave, she's sick. Ralph Cunningham might be joining us this afternoon later, etc. So without further ado, we're going to leave North America and we're going to go down to South America. And remember that the sun acts differently in the southern hemisphere, right? Please remember that about east and west, north and south, and things like that. And the toilets go the opposite direction. In any event, Anna's going to take us there and show her project, which is in Peru.
Thank you, Carl. And I would also like to thank my chair, Juan Burke, who has guided me through this whole process, and the rest of my committee members, who include Brian Kelly, who I don't think is here yet, and all of my classmates and colleagues who have helped me out throughout this process. Right now, I would like to talk to you about building education and the design of a flexible model for a high school for sustainably developing communities in Latin America, and more specifically in Peru. So this presentation will deal with some of the issues that have inspired this thesis, how those have led to the creation of a program for a model for a school, the kit of parts that make up this campus, how it could be applied to different communities with varying needs. And to finish off, I will share some user experiences in order to get a better idea of how this campus can be used. And so to begin, some of the research that I have done has been through research that the World Bank has done, the United Nations, and similar organizations, and they have all concluded that quality education is a key component in order to have a prosperous and successful country. And specifically in Latin America, all of the leaders in the field of development currently are making education their #1 priority. We can take a look at Peru a little more closely, and even though there have been significant advances in the education reforms that they have done, there's still a long way to go. And knowing their responsibility and in order to provide quality education throughout the country, they have recently released an educational reform that has 4 main points. One is to value teaching as a career. Another is to better the teaching environments of these educational spaces. Another is to have improved management of the educational system as a whole, and to bridge the gap of the educational infrastructure. This thesis will specifically deal with bridging the gap of educational infrastructure. But we'll also try to tackle valuing the value of teaching as a career by creating spaces that can help teachers feel valued, and by creating better teaching environments for spaces for improved learning. Unfortunately, currently in Peru, there's only a 65 completion rate of secondary school, and secondary school over there consists of 7th grade through 11th grade. And the 35% of students that do not complete secondary school are going through hardships with their family in terms of financial means, and so they end up staying home and working for their families, or they might lack motivation because they might have seen that their parents didn't finish high school, and so they might not be as motivated or encouraged to continue on. And one of the main reasons being the quality of the spaces. I will show you some imagery in order to get a better grasp of these, the state of the infrastructure over there. And here you can begin to understand the state of the infrastructure over there. A lot of the classrooms might be sorry, I forgot to mention that all of these issues are the most prevalent in the Peruvian Amazon, and that's where this thesis is located. And so here you can start seeing some of the infrastructure where they use roof systems that do not necessarily respond to the climatic conditions and so provide poor acoustical conditions in the classrooms. And they have very few resources. Some classrooms even have missing roof parts. And so this poor infrastructure combined with long commutes to classrooms lead to students not completing school. The Peruvian Amazon takes up 60% of the Peruvian territory, and so you can imagine in this map how much of the country is dealing with similar conditions. And so the average commute for a teacher or a student is about 5 hours a day, and that commute usually happens either by the piquete boats that you can see in that first image, or either walking or through the use of public transportation in scarce dirt roads. And so both of these issues, the lack of proper infrastructure, lack of motivation, all of this leads to absenteeism in the classrooms. And this leads us to the need for an architectural response. In order to test the model for this school, a site has been chosen for a case study in Satipo, Peru. The choice for this site was done based on the region with the most need. A quick look at all of the regions and their current state of their infrastructure, along with how many schools currently need restructuring and revamping, led to the choice of Junín, which is located right in the center of Peru. And within this region, the province that needed the most help was Satipo. And so here you can get an aerial view of this provincial capital. This provincial capital is a good representation of many of the towns in the Peruvian Amazon, because it's showing a typical amalgamation of the different community types in this region that are mestizo people and indigenous native populations. And in most of these provinces, they tend to be pretty segregated. And a lot of these are currently trying to fix that so that the different community types can interact a bit more. And so if we look at the site a little more closely, we can see that it's situated in the northern part of the town of Satipo, which has a population of 30,000 people. It was chosen to be situated in this part of the town because this area is intended for future growth, and that compiled with information of their locations of existing educational infrastructure and populated centers with need of educational facilities located the site right in the northern part of the town. And so, as Carl mentioned, here's a reminder that because the site is located in the southern hemisphere, the sun path will be different than what we're used to here, and so that influenced the location of the educational buildings to create a preference of the classrooms on the southern side of each of the courtyards for better ambient light and better learning conditions. That, coupled with the predominant wind directions that are coming from the north, northeast, and northwest, it meant that most of the classrooms were located south and on the eastern western ends of the courtyards, leaving the northern part of the courtyards for support, restrooms, storage, etc. This campus is organized off of a main corridor where each one of the courtyards stems off of it, juxtaposed by a service entry and exit on the opposite side of the campus in order to service their cafeterias and all of their service. And so all of this comes together in a program that is divided into dormitories that are on the northern part of the site in order to house these students so that they don't have to endure long commutes, so that they can live there during the week and rejoin their families over the weekend. These dormitories are separated by a soccer pitch right in the middle so that there could be a little buffer between dormitories and the classrooms. And then in this whole area over here on the southern part of the site, we have the student learning spaces and the community classrooms in order to engage adult learners, to have them come back and finish off school or entertain activities over the weekend in order to continue their education that way, and hopefully to inspire and promote learning at a later age. And so if we enter campus, we can begin to see some of the components that make up this kit of parts. Here we have a view of the assembly pavilion, and this is where students would gather every morning in order to go through some of their morning rituals of general announcements and such. And so once we start getting into some of the parts of the kit, we have a smaller module and a larger module. And so I'll go into detail of each one of these, starting by the smaller module that you can see in the model there, so you can pick it up and take a look at it and pass it around if you'd like. And so this smaller module is built with a frame of cast-in-place reinforced concrete infilled with locally handmade brick, with sustainably sourced local Quinilla hardwood trusses and purlins. And those are covered up on the interior with woven palm leaf screens in order to create a sound buffer between that and the corrugated metal roof on top. And this smaller module can house classrooms and dorms. So here in this model, you can see that in the classroom module, the outer wall can act as a storage space for lockers. And here is that scene where with the two thicker walls on one side, you can have storage for books and such. And we will take a look at how it can be used on the exterior. But these classrooms can be aggregated in a way that you can have a traditional classroom, and any classroom that's joined by an open space can eventually be converted into a classroom that's triple its size in order to have larger activities and for better learning for different types of activities. And so here we can see an image of what those classrooms would look like if all of their doors were opened and all of their spaces would join for activities in the center. So that same module, as you can see, is transformed very easily into a dormitory, where in the classroom you saw that the outer wall was used for lockers. Here it easily gets flipped into the interior in order to get used for storage for the clothing and things that students have. And in this view, you can see a night rendering of some of these dormitories aggregated in a courtyard where they might gather after their classes and be nearing their dinner time. If we take a look at the larger module, you will see that it's composed of the same building materials, and the only difference is that it's twice as wide, and that allows to house programs such as the library, the art studios, labs, vocational classrooms as are required in their curriculum, and for administrative offices. Here's a view of one of those spaces that's the dual module and in the library. And here you can also see that the thickness of these walls is taken advantage of for storage of books. And here we can see a view of the community courtyard that's located at the southern part of the site, where students can interact with community members in order to learn more about their environment, about cultivation in their area, in order to have better respect for their environment. And in order to understand its applicability, we can see that the scheme that I was going through was the middle one on these boards over here, in a site with about 30,000 inhabitants. If, for example, the site is located in a little more remote area, where students would be commuting even further, but there would be less students, there could be a program with less classrooms, but that houses all of the students. In the first scenario, a third of the students were housed. Here, all of them would be housed. So quite easily, you can see the courtyards replicated in order to house more students, and these courtyards shrinking in order to fit all of the program. In a community that is slightly larger and has developed more around it, the site could possibly be located in a brownfield where there's a lot of residences nearby, and so students would not need to reside on campus. All of the space that was previously used for dorms can now be used for the separation of the 10th and 11th graders, where the 7th, 8th, and 9th would be in their own courtyards. And in order to get a grasp of how these spaces are used, I will introduce you to Paula, who is a student who represents a third of the student population, and she lives 5 hours away. So during the week, she can not commute to school. So she lives in one of the residences there, and then enters the campus, and then joins the rest of the students for their activities. Then we have a teacher who resides on campus so that he can also avoid long commutes. And he very much enjoys arts and artisanal activities, so he comes to the campus on the weekends occasionally in order to partake in activities in the southern courtyard with local community members. Then we have a student commuter who only lives 20 minutes away, but because he has low means, he takes advantage of eating at school. So as soon as he's there waiting for the General Assembly to begin, he's having breakfast with a lot of his classmates. And then to end, there is the adult learner, Maria, and she dropped out of school when she was in school, and so she decided to go back now. So she's taking advantage of these community classrooms. And because she's skilled in weaving and textiles, she is able to teach some of the students and partake in these activities over the weekend. So overall, I would like to I hope that I've transmitted the idea that this is a very flexible and adaptable design that can be used for varying needs of communities. And with that, I would like to transition and open it up for questions and comments.
What, can you just clarify, in this perspective right here, what is...
I'm in so much trouble with Kelly.
I just,
You guys want Carl back again, right? You guys gotta talk to him.
really point of clarification, in the perspective
Sure.
down here, what is the building that's beyond the, you said there was two modules, the major and the
Yeah,
minor.
so this is the smaller module, which is a
Right.
classroom. This is the larger module, which is the library.
Right, then
And
what's
what
that
you're seeing in the
building?
back, that's the assembly pavilion that you saw in one of the earlier renderings.
Up there, up top, gotcha. Okay, so there's three different typologies, if you will, that make up the campus.
Yes, yes, and depending on the size of the community, they might have or may not have one of these assembly pavilions.
Thank you. It's interesting because I intuitively, I think there's some strength in the idea to create a flexible community that you've done that can grow and expand as the needs of the community change and adapt over time. And I think there's some wisdom in having a simple kind of kit of parts, as you talked about, having this flexible base structure that I'm sure we'll talk about in more depth. But my instinct as I was kind of listening to your presentation, kind of looking at the campus, is that a third building that might have anchored it a bit more would have been needed. And I was wondering if that was being a ghost in, and if that were the case, it would have been nice to see a little bit more, or perhaps you can tell me why you didn't develop or articulate that building a little bit more. And again, I think there's all sorts of good reasons that you've talked about in terms of why the roofs do what they do in terms of solar and wind and all of that. But I wonder, was there any space or a need for that third building potentially to be a spot like it? For example, if you've got guys and gals living on this campus at nighttime, like they're not going to be in the soccer field probably. So is there like some kind of more evening enclosed space that this could have had? And could that have had a slightly different architectural vocabulary? Did you think about that? Did you explore that?
Yes, I think that would have provided for a very nice opportunity. Right now, within the residential courtyards, for example, referring to your point, we can see that all of the dorms are aggregated around the larger module. So within that smaller community, we see that they interact with a slightly larger building. But I see how an even larger, maybe similar to the Assembly Pavilion, could act as more of a gathering node for students, yes. The reason why I didn't elaborate that one too much more was because originally I just wanted that to be a covered structure to but still open enough on the plan in order to gather students and receive them and provide them with a shaded area while they're getting their morning announcements.
And is this built by locals?
Yes, it is.
And you can get milled lumber to this site?
Yes, it is.
It's common.
In most of these sites, you would actually be able to find that same lumber on the site.
Is there, forgive me if you mentioned this, but is the idea to train people how to build this so then they have a craft and a...
Precisely, yes. So part of the community aspect of the building and the vocational classrooms allows for the students to learn directly from the crafts and the skills that are innate in these artisanal communities, but unfortunately are not passed on through generations. And so as you can see in some of these different wall types, and you can see clearly in the model too, I've incorporated some of the symbols that are important to these native communities. And so if we have the local community members building them, then they can apply these symbols in the pattern work of the brickwork.
Point to where that assembly building is on your trying to talk about.
Right here.
Oh.
So if you enter campus right through here, that's the first structure that you would encounter.
What are the buildings you first encounter here?
So all of these are part of the community classroom, so the students wouldn't necessarily use them. And so this would be an entry gate, and you would pass through here, and these are all administrative offices.
Anna, you've given us a lot to look at and absorb, and applaud you on that. I think that we're going to be able to dive really deep into a lot of this, given what you've been able to show us in the model. I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about the approaches to ventilation versus sunlight and fenestration, and so where are things really for ventilation and where are things actually to bring light into the building? It doesn't seem like you're using the area up top here in this rendering for ventilation because you've put a roof structure underneath that, right? So I'm curious, like, really what sort of the purpose of that element is. There are also little aspects down here that in your renderings show light coming through, but I don't think they're actually going to ever see light. So the canopies overhang very far. And so if you could just talk a little bit about that approach and if you had any process or anything along the way that would lead us to how you got to that.
Sure. I think one of the main priorities in the design was to prioritize the ventilation, being that their average temperatures are in the 70s. We didn't need any formal HVAC systems or anything like that. So taking advantage of these passive systems, I wanted to include as many openings in the building as possible. But after seeing the model, I've noticed how little openings the building actually has. So moving forward, I know I could potentially flip the openings so that within these bays, instead of having lockers, I could prioritize openings for more ventilation and slightly less storage.
The overhang is so deep that you're not actually going to be getting any light into those spaces. So then it's left sort of to the ends, and in many cases, the end is very closed in.
Yes, so this module is located for the more ideal classroom setting, facing north that way. So the southern side gets all the ambient light, and so it's not getting any direct light from this overhang.
So, but I thought there was a roof over this.
Yes, there is.
Inside. So if light's coming in here, it's not actually getting down into that space.
So the palm leaf screens are actually located just below the purlins, but above the trusses. So all of that space is open.
Really quick, so in your rendering, there's no ceiling.
No, there's not one here. This is the finished ceiling.
We were obviously both confused on that.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so here you can see these rolls of palm screens that will be placed on top of the trusses.
For the sake of your drawing, and I think for the clarity to get this point across, I would just throw artificial lights into that rendering you did to
Sure.
make the roof structure look a little bit more illuminated.
Okay.
Because right now, I think Colin and I both were looking at that. We see the model, and I thought, oh, well, this one's open because that one probably has an attic of some sort.
Oh,
so I
okay.
think that's where the confusion's coming from.
Great, thank you.
What's the hot spot on the floor in that one?
That's a mistake in rendering.
Okay. Since we're talking about light, I'm like, wow, something's.
The photographer's in there.
Yes.
You know, it's very sort of regimented, you know, the sort of spaces. Is there a certain proportion or square footage of open space you had in mind, you know, that these buildings are making these courtyards? Could they have been smaller maybe, or it looks a little kind of military-like?
The spaces between the classrooms?
Yeah.
Yes, I played around with the size of the courtyard a bit, and you can see a slight variation in the residential one. I think I wanted to maintain a bit of distance between the classrooms because they're so open. I didn't want the sound to distract and take away from the learning that's happening in these classrooms. So if there are people playing in the courtyards, they could be slightly further away from the classrooms.
And what is the material? It's not paving, but what is it?
No, it's more of a
Clay?
gravelly sand material, yeah. Which is how most of their open spaces are in this region.
And the larger trees that we see, are those actually at this particular site?
Yes, they are. You can find some of those in their main square. They're called rain trees.
I mean, but for instance, it's pretty big. Is that there on this site?
No, it's not. So ideally,
So you're not working around an existing landscape?
No.
But you would use trees as the helping site project?
In order to locate the buildings? Yes.
That was the right answer.
Yeah, so right now I'm just showing this one as hypothetically on this part of the courtyard, but let's say if there's another one here.
But you're going
I
to
would
look for
keep
trees
that.
and you're going to go, we'll use this tree as part of the courtyard.
Yes.
We're going to build around the courtyard.
That's right.
Good. I have the same question about the extent of it. I did the calculation. It's about 4 lengths of this grate space to get from one end to the other. And I know you want air to move through, and I think, but I would look at the distance of walking on this. It seems a little stretched out, and the actual enclosure seems a little porous at times. I don't know what you'd lose in terms of ventilation and sound, but still, I think it seems a little stretched out.
Mm-hmm.
I'd try to be a little more compact.
Okay.
Yeah.
We did have a conversation about how people are getting around campus and if they're walking a little too much, but we figured that based on them really just using certain courtyards during different parts of the day, then they're not really going back to the dorm in the middle of the afternoon.
So they stay in that area between 8:05 and 5.
Yes, if
fundamentally.
anything, they're just going up to the field and then going back to the classrooms. Sure.
So you talked about the way in which poor infrastructure and absenteeism and so forth impacted the way you approach this. what's the extent to which you looked at the way the community views space and uses space, and how did that sort of community perspective influence the way you've done some of these moves? So you talked about other courts where this big tree is in surrounding cities. So you must have obviously looked around and seen the way design happens in these small towns. So how did you pull from those cultural references to do what you did?
Sure. One of the main drivers was that a lot of these community members, especially the indigenous and native ones, are very much connected to their environment, and they are very respectful of it. And unfortunately, a lot of the mestizo communities are tearing down a lot of their forest. And so as a way of reconnecting back to nature, I provided them with some of these orchard-like spaces within the community courtyards and spaces for crops, so that they could look out onto these courtyards and really connect back with nature that way and learn from each other, because they would be mixing these communities within the same campus.
And I think you've presented some really beautiful drawings, and
Thank you.
I'm particularly pleased with the form and the tectonics of the buildings. They really express this idea of a groundedness with the masonry construction, and then kind of a tectonic clarity, a net cast over those stereotomic spaces, making a kind of a wood construction overhead. So I think that's to be applauded. The questions I have are building on Michael and Eric's comments, both about compactness and, I guess, hierarchy of open space. So there's a real clarity to the buildings in the figure ground plan. But when I think about this idea of weaving or warp and weft at the scale of site planning, there's kind of a sameness to the size of the courtyards, and also the path hierarchy and how you get from one courtyard to the next. It seems like you might slip between the corners rather than kind of experiencing them in a more direct way. And then in terms of compactness, one thought is that it might be a solution of scheduling and programming, where the adults could use the classrooms that the children are using in the evening, and you don't even have to build that lower third of the campus. And it's just how you creatively, it's like our building here, right? It's empty all summer. But now actually we're using it in the winter, in the evenings, for our, the other programs that the school has added over the years.
Sure, thank you. That's a great comment. So a little bit of that I explored in this smaller design, where I've gotten rid of the community courtyard altogether and hoped that they would utilize the same classrooms in the evenings. And so there would be that kind of usage of the spaces. In terms of your comment about the lack of hierarchy, originally I didn't have this covered pavilion in the middle of their main courtyard. I was hoping for this to be the main space where all students would gather between their classes, because this is the general assembly building, this is their cafeteria, and so there could be a lot of spillage, let's say, between these buildings. And so by looking at the size of it, it seemed that it was awfully large, and so if the students wanted any kind of coverage, I ended up placing a pavilion right in the middle in order to provide a shaded area. Perhaps by eliminating that one and substituting it with more landscaping, that could provide a sense of a larger courtyard and more of a hierarchy there. But I understand that there could be more done in that aspect in order to...
Take a look at Sheridan's plan for Cranbrook.
Okay.
So, remind me, did you give an age in general for the students?
Yeah, so it's 7th graders until 11th graders.
One thing that strikes me is it lacks a little bit of fun and excitement. And
okay.
We do educational spaces for students all the time, and we try to make them as most engaging spaces as possible. And and I don't know enough about Peruvian culture, but the one image you showed was brightly colored. And so part of me says, is there a palette within the materials that you're working with, or a differentiation within those palettes? You show a really dark wood and a really light wood, but everything seems to have the same monotone nature to it. And I wonder if there isn't something that can be had in excitement of materials, or some fun for learning that can be had.
No, that's a great comment. As a matter of fact, at one point I considered painting these buildings on the outside based on their users. So the 7th graders would get one color, the 8th graders another, so that there could be a sense of identity with the structure. Not really sure why I didn't keep pursuing that route, but from my research, it did seem that creating something fun like that to help students identify with their home bases was a very good use of their spaces.
And I want to compliment you for getting to where you've gotten this large section perspective in the foreground. The kind of, oh my God, drawing is very effective, I think, in conveying an enormous amount of information at a glance. The thing I'm hearing from people is really about homogeneity. That there's a kind of homogeneous quality to things, and that was noted in terms of the landscape, in terms of the materiality, and I would even say that the modularity of the project contributes to that, and really goes back to begging for there to be several unique pieces that would stand out as maybe breaking the rules.
Sure.
I think about the places of assembly as perhaps being those places that could be different than the others. And they are different, but they are by just shade of gray different. Sure. And I'm thinking that those things could be different by in fact, actually, if you were to do this, you would provide a placeholder for the building. And then you would say, now that you guys know what you're doing, make something. And it might be a chaos and disorder, but I'm just finding that everything has a kind of, the landscape's homogeneous, the pathwork is homogeneous, the trees, with the exception of these spectacular trees, homogeneous, the material palette's homogeneous, and then the module that this gets made out of is a homogeneous thing. So we need something to kind of shake it up, both to jostle the spaces, so there's a hierarchy of spaces, that there's a hierarchy of material, and that there's a hierarchy of building on the site, so that some figural spaces and some figural buildings tend to sing a little bit louder.
Sure, yes, that's a great comment.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to piggyback on the playfulness comment and connect it to the comment about natural daylighting. I'm wondering, it seems like this material is possibly a little bit underexplored, especially given the culture of weaving and how that's a skill. I wonder if there's a place for woven fabrics, even woven fabrics that are porous, that can act almost like mosquito netting, right? Possibly instead of a roof in some places, to let in natural light, to keep the bugs out. I know here in the United States we're much more concerned about mosquito bites, but so I know also the woven palm leaves as structure, they're great roof structures because they swell when it rains and keep the rain out, but then when it's dry they shrink and let sort of light come through. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if there's a use of textiles in fabrics, both as mosquito netting and daylighting, but also as that play, the colorful kind of playful aspect.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think moving forward, that could be the next thing that I would explore in terms of expanding the palette and the parts of the kit. Thank you.
This, in terms of retinal burn, memorable drawings, this section perspective down there is really terrific, and it speaks volumes about what you're seeking to accomplish in the project. As regards to the comments people made about the sameness of it, when Richard Meyer's office was given the commission to do the Getty Museum out in California, Ralph Lerner, who was dean at Princeton at the time, said it looked like they had a World's Fair and only invited one architect. And what is kind of interesting about this project is the master plan. It strikes me that a school like this probably would be built over time.
Yeah.
Because the resources tend not to arrive all at the same time to build it. So then the question becomes, it gets back to some earlier comments, what is the master plan imprint that you leave here that others would pick up on in the future and would do buildings that would be sympathetic, but maybe not all the same as what you're doing and stuff. And in a way, I think what you're making is almost like a little city plan, you know. And I think if it was a little bit more analogous to a city about pathways and the way they engage edges of buildings and the way that open space engages buildings, it probably would be a little bit more successful. And a good example is the soccer field. I can't tell if those buildings face it or they have their backs to it, you know. And
These?
Go ahead.
These?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're facing their backs to the field.
They're facing their backs. Oh, that's a clever answer. That is, I gotta say, that is a thesis student answer if ever there was one. Boy, Anna, if you've learned something at Maryland, that may just be it right there in that answer. But if that's the plaza, right? If that's the plaza, how do the buildings face the plaza? And where are the neighborhood squares and things like that? And it would probably go some measure to tightening it up to make it more analogous in that regard. Not literally like a city, but that the main buildings face the plaza and they have a kind of graciousness about things that happen there that are hierarchically understandable.
Maybe it's a village or something.
Or a village, yeah, but whatever. I mean, something whereby there's clearly a hierarchy of public and private, and all the gray and black to white and all the gray zones in between would be legible in terms of how the landscape and the buildings face and are organized.
Sure, yeah, definitely. I think in this scenario, I prioritized the intimacy of the courtyards as opposed to more of these public spaces, but that's a great point.
But I think that's what we're saying, it's not intimate.
Okay.
Well, and
Yeah.
in the city, there are places which are intimate, and then there are places which are very public. Or the village, I guess.
Okay, in architecture, a lot of time we kind of try to balance between unity and variety. Too much unity, we say it's boring. Too much variety, it's chaos. I like here that there is unity with the buildings, the material. And all these spaces that you have in between the buildings, I wouldn't call them courtyards because they are too big for a courtyard, I think. So they are open spaces, and if you design them and you design them different, you see it's like outdoor rooms, outdoor big rooms. So if you design them and you design them differently and you create some of them to be more intimate and some of them less intimate, bigger, and so it will do the project really great.
Yeah, I think that was definitely.
Yeah, but that's the missing thing for me, is these outdoor spaces that are not designed right now. You see just like openness, just a corridor or something, but these are outdoor rooms that have to be designed.
Thank you for your model. That's fantastic. And did you make the cube as well?
No, it happens to match nicely though.
Well, I appreciate that you actually matched your base with your model. I mean, that's an architect right there. You know, you actually thought about it. So thank you.
Details.
Did you think about putting solar panels on all the roofs so you don't need electricity there?
No, that didn't come up, but I think that would be a great consideration. Yeah.
Yes, I cannot lose the opportunity, since usually I agree with Professor Bell. For one, that I disagree, I cannot lose.
It's about her, not me. So go on.
The question, just because you raise a simple question and it's not convincing to me, this idea that the soccer field is the piazza and therefore the units should look at the piazza is not convincing. The soccer field is a place where some guys from time to time go and kick the ball, whereas for the proportion point of view, the actual piazza is the one that in fact the buildings are facing. Well, whatever, inside, that one for instance, or the other one up there, or the other one there, right?
Yeah, there's.
That's enough.
Antonio, it
I didn't
depends
say.
on how you
I
use
didn't
it.
say that the question of uniformity is not relevant. Yeah, I agree. Having more variety would have helped. But the idea that the facing, since we made a discussion out of that, and it's a good theme. I think that they facing each building or many buildings face two spaces. And now the idea that the larger space has more, can claim to be more important is not always like that, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Have you ever walked on a soccer field?
Yes.
It's
pretty large.
It's enormous, right? I mean, it's so big that, like, if you go to DC United Stadium, which I think Mr. Marshall there knows something about, the field still seems enormous, even with that big building around it. So, I mean, I agree with what everybody's saying, which is that hierarchy is an issue. And I think, and I have to say, you have a very, very beautiful project here, so we'll start with that. But I think that the sense of scale is a bit off here. I think that most of these spaces are actually way too big. I mean, like really, really too big. If you look at any kind of university plan, you see big spaces and small spaces, and you've kind of tried by putting buildings in the middle, which I don't really like, honestly. I would like them to be, I'm giving you two different things, right? It's too big, it's too small. Pick at that. The other thing that I was kind of wondering about, and I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your presentation, but in this perspective, which I agree is really great, what happens down the middle there where it's open? Where is that?
So those are connections onto the other courtyards.
Got it.
So those
okay.
are openings that allow for porosity between these.
So I really like that. I mean, if you took kind of a highlighter and drew the circulation paths through there, you'd see that you have actually more major and more minor, which I think is really good. The other thing I would say about the buildings, so here's the trap you've made for yourself, right? Which is you've made these beautiful modules, okay? But what we're seeing is what happens when one of the buildings is bigger, right? Or maybe four of them are put together. It's back to this issue of hierarchy. So I just think that would be the next thing you would do, is look, it's hard. I mean, Matt's comment is exactly right. It's hard for an architect to get out of your own way when you've designed all the buildings.
Yeah.
To break your own rule. It's very hard.
To get to that point, there was a lot of back and forth in the design process between working at the campus scale and trying to design the modules. And so when I first started off by trying to design the whole campus, and that obviously changed drastically as soon as I started inputting real sizes of the buildings. And I think that there could be another iteration back at the larger scale. Yeah.
Keep going. I'm sorry.
Anna, I just wanted to say thank you for taking on a project like this. I think it takes a lot of guts to do a public, sort of an impact project for Thesis, so thank you. I think when you take on a project like this, you have to kind of come armed with a lot of other things than in a typical thesis. So you need to really understand all the sustainable elements, solar, ventilation, everything like that. You need to have a strategy to explain the hierarchy, and you need to have a strategy to explain, so you've kind of like rolled out an idea that could be deployed in multiple places. I think one big thing that's missing is the way you would manage a not completely flat site.
Yeah.
I think that's something to add to this.
Sure, definitely.
Great.
Okay, so I'm just going to close this session. Thank you for your comments. And before we dismiss Anna's project, I just want to say thank you for your work. Since Anna approached me with her ideas for this thesis, they resonated with me very much because I'm also, I also have Latin American background, and I also share the idea that education is the key to a society's development. So that in itself just made it really important for me. With that being said, Anna, you're a really hard worker. You're very thorough. We had many discussions about this. A half-an-hour presentation doesn't do justice to all the work that you put into this. And I also want to thank you for being so professional in the face of hardship, personal hardship. You did wonderfully. One comment about compactness that I want to say. It's funny because there's many issues that are cultural that get in the way of a project like this. And so if anybody has ever been to Latin America, anybody know, for instance, the campus of the National University in Mexico City, you might understand what open space means in Latin America. So the issue of compactness or the size or scale of open spaces, public spaces, plaza, the term plaza says it all. And it's something that harks back to before Columbus. So there's a slightly different understanding of openness in Latin America. That's something that I wanted to say. And I think that also Anna is underplaying the role that that the users can give to this set of sort of apparently rigid models that can be personified later on. That was also some of the discussions that we had. So anyway, I want to applaud your efforts and congratulations.
That she did this metric. The whole thing was done, metric all. You got the long measuring stick. All right, we're going to go to the next